The blood-red sunset painted the horizon as Nora Dawson clutched her father's pocket watch, the only thing she had left of him now that the earth had swallowed him whole. Standing at the edge of his freshly dug grave in McGill, Nevada, she wondered how she would manage the ranch alone, and if she even wanted to. Spring of 1878 had arrived with little mercy for the 22-year-old daughter of a cattle rancher. Her father, Thomas Dawson, had been the only family she'd known since her mother's passing when she was just 7. Now, at the age of 22, she stood truly alone. "Miss Dawson," a voice called from behind her. It was Mr. Holloway, her father's banker and apparently his closest confidant in matters of business. "We should discuss your father's affairs before nightfall." Nora nodded, pulling her black shawl tighter around her shoulders as they walked toward her modest but well-built ranch house. The Dawson Ranch wasn't the largest in the territory, but it was respectable 500 acres with a herd of nearly 300 cattle, a small barn, and the main house that her father had built with his own hands when he'd first staked his claim 15 years ago. Inside, Mr. Holloway removed his hat and cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Dawson, I'm afraid I have some difficult news regarding your father's financial situation." Nora steeled herself, hands folded in her lap. "Please speak plainly, Mr. Holloway. I've had enough grief for one day without having to decipher riddles. Your father borrowed heavily against the ranch last winter after losing nearly half the herd in that terrible snowstorm. The loan is due in 30 days, and without it being paid, I'm afraid the bank will have no choice but to foreclose." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. "How much?" $2,000. She nearly laughed at the impossibility of it. $2,000 might as well have been $20,000 for all the likelihood she had of raising it in a month. "There is one alternative," Mr. Holloway continued, not meeting her eyes. "Mr. Richard Reynolds has expressed interest in acquiring the Dawson property. His son, Xavier, has been authorized to negotiate terms." Nora's spine stiffened. The Reynolds family owned the largest spread in the territory, nearly 10,000 acres just north of McGill. Richard Reynolds was known for his ruthless business practices and had been trying to buy her father's land for years, particularly for the water rights to Cottonwood Creek that ran through the eastern portion. "I'll consider my options," she said firmly. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Holloway." After showing him out, Nora spent a sleepless night weighing her meager choices. By morning, she'd made her decision. She would try to work the ranch herself, at least until she could find a buyer who wasn't Richard Reynolds. Her father had taught her everything about ranching, branding, driving cattle, even fixing fences. She was no stranger to hard work. 3 days later, as Nora was struggling to repair a broken wagon wheel, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced riders approaching. She reached for the rifle her father always kept by the front door, holding it ready but not raised as 3 horsemen came into view. The lead rider was a young man with dark hair and a confident posture that bordered on arrogance. Behind him rode 2 ranch hands, each with Reynolds' brand on their saddles. The leader dismounted with fluid grace, removing his hat to reveal piercing blue eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. "Miss Dawson," he said with a slight bow. "Xavier Reynolds. I believe Mr. Holloway mentioned I'd be calling." Nora didn't lower the rifle. "He mentioned you might. I didn't say I'd receive you." Xavier's smile only widened. "It seems your father's stubbornness lives on in his daughter. Admirable, if impractical. May I speak with you about your situation?" "I promise it will be worth your while." Reluctantly, Nora invited them in, keeping the rifle within reach as she offered coffee. The 2 ranch hands remained outside while Xavier settled into her father's chair with unsettling familiarity. "I'll be direct, Miss Dawson. My father has authorized me to offer you $800 for the ranch immediate payment, enough to settle your debts and start fresh elsewhere. Perhaps in town, where a young lady like yourself belongs. Nora nearly choked on her coffee. 800. This land is worth 5 times that amount, Mr. Reynolds. Worth is relative to one's ability to maintain ownership, Xavier countered smoothly. The bank will seize it in 27 days, and you'll walk away with nothing. $800 is generous under the circumstances. The circumstances being that your father has wanted this land for years, and now sees an opportunity to steal it. Nora stood, her patience evaporating. Thank you for your offer, Mr. Reynolds, but I must decline. Xavier's pleasant expression hardened. I urge you to reconsider. A woman alone cannot manage a cattle ranch. It's simply not possible. I'll manage just fine, Nora replied, walking to the door to indicate the meeting was over. Xavier rose slowly, placing his hat back on his head with deliberate care. You have your father's spirit, Miss Dawson. Unfortunately, you also have his poor judgment. My offer stands for 1 week. After that, I'll simply wait for the bank to do what's inevitable. As he reached the door, he paused, looking down at her with an expression that sent a chill through her. One way or another, Miss Dawson, this ranch will be mine, which means you'll belong to me as well. I belong to no one, Mr. Reynolds, Nora replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Xavier laughed softly. We'll see about that. After they rode away, Nora sank onto the porch steps, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She needed skilled hands to work the cattle, someone who knew the business. With the little money left in her father's strongbox, she might hire a couple of hands for a few weeks, but not long enough to make a difference. The next morning, Nora rode into McGill, a town of barely 200 souls that consisted of a main street with the essential businesses: general store, saloon, blacksmith, hotel, and bank. She tied her horse outside the Rusty Nail Saloon, straightened her riding skirt, and walked inside with more confidence than she felt. The dim interior fell silent as she entered, all eyes turning to the unusual sight of Thomas Dawson's daughter in a saloon. She spotted Sheriff Miller at a corner table and made her way directly to him, ignoring the whispers that followed. Miss Dawson, the sheriff said, rising to his feet. My condolences about your father, fine man. Thank you, Sheriff. I'm looking to hire a couple of ranch hands. I thought you might know of reliable men in need of work. Sheriff Miller's weathered face creased with concern. Heard you might be facing some troubles with the bank. Reynolds been to see you yet? Yesterday. His offer was insulting. The sheriff nodded, unsurprised. That sounds about right. Not many hands looking for work this time of year, I'm afraid. Most are already contracted through the summer. A voice spoke from behind her. I know someone who's looking. Nora turned to find a man she didn't recognize. Tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin and light brown hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn denim jacket. His eyes were a striking green, studying her with open interest. This here's Nash Rayburn, the sheriff introduced. Rode in about a week ago. Been doing odd jobs around town. Madam, Nash said with a respectful nod. I couldn't help overhearing. I've worked cattle most of my life. If you're hiring, I'm available. Nora hesitated, assessing him. He was perhaps in his late 20s, with capable-looking hands and a direct gaze that met hers without wavering. What brings you to McGill, Mr. Rayburn? Just passing through originally, but I like the look of the place. References. Worked 3 seasons for the Cartwright spread near Virginia City. Before that, with the Bar K in Wyoming Territory. Sheriff can wire them if you need verification. Sheriff Miller nodded. Already did when he first came to town. Checks out. Nora considered her options, which were admittedly few. I can offer room, board, and $20 a month. It's less than standard, I know, but it's all I can manage right now." Nash smiled, revealing a small dimple in his right cheek. "When do I start?" "Right now, if you're able. I've got a broken wagon wheel that needs fixing and cattle that need moving to fresh pasture." Nash drained his coffee and stood. "Let me gather my things from the boarding house. I'll meet you at the general store in 30 minutes. True to his word, Nash was waiting with his saddle and a modest bundle of belongings when Nora emerged from the store with supplies. As they rode back to the ranch, Nora explained her situation in more detail, including the looming bank deadline and Reynolds' offer. $800 for 500 acres with water rights. Nash whistled low. "That's not an offer, that's robbery." "Exactly. But unless I can raise $2,000 in less than a month, it won't matter." "How many head of cattle do you have?" "About 300. My father was planning to drive them to the railhead in Elko next month for sale. The price is better there than selling locally." Nash nodded thoughtfully. "That's good thinking. If you could get them there early, you might make enough to cover the loan." "Perhaps, but I can't drive 300 cattle by myself, and I can't afford to hire a full crew." "Maybe you don't need to," Nash said. "If we could get even half the herd to Elko in the next 2 weeks, you might raise enough to at least buy some time with the bank." Nora glanced at him, noting his use of "we" rather than "you." "It's a 4-day drive with a full crew. How would we manage with just the 2 of us?" "We'll find a way. I've got some ideas," Nash replied, his confidence infectious. "First, let's fix that wagon wheel and assess what else needs immediate attention." By nightfall, Nash had repaired the wheel, mended a section of broken corral, and helped Nora move 50 head of cattle to the north pasture. As they sat on the porch after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Nora found herself studying her new hire with growing appreciation. He worked quickly and efficiently, knew his way around cattle, and didn't seem bothered by taking direction from a woman, a refreshing change from most men she'd encountered. "Tell me more about yourself, Mr. Rayburn," she said, sipping the coffee he'd brewed after dinner. It was better than hers, something else to appreciate. Not much to tell. Orphaned young, raised by an uncle who had a small ranch in Kansas. Started working cattle drives at 16. Been wandering since my uncle passed 5 years ago. He leaned back in his chair, stretching long legs out before him. "What about you?" "Always lived here, since I was 7. Before that, we lived in Missouri, but my mother died and my father decided we needed a fresh start. He brought me west, worked odd jobs until he saved enough to stake this claim." She gazed out at the land, a mixture of sagebrush, cottonwoods along the creek, and rolling hills that gave way to mountains in the distance. "It wasn't much when we arrived, but we built it together." "It's fine land," Nash agreed. "I can see why Reynolds wants it. That creek alone is worth fighting for in this territory." "It's not just the land," Nora admitted quietly. "Xavier Reynolds has made it clear he's interested in more than just the property." Nash's expression darkened. "Has he bothered you?" "Not yet, beyond his declaration that I'll belong to him once he acquires the ranch. His father has been trying to arrange a marriage between us for years. My father always refused. And now he thinks he can force your hand through financial pressure," Nash concluded, his jaw tightening. "That's not a man, that's a vulture." "A vulture with money and influence," Nora reminded him. "But I won't be forced into marriage, no matter what happens with the ranch." Nash studied her for a moment, his green eyes reflecting the lantern light. "No, I don't imagine you would be. Thomas Dawson clearly raised a daughter with backbone." Nora smiled at that, feeling a strange flutter in her chest at his approving gaze. "We should turn in. Dawn comes early, and we have much to do tomorrow if we're to attempt this cattle drive." Over the next few days, Nora and Nash fell into an efficient partnership. They rose before dawn, worked the cattle, repaired what needed fixing, and planned their strategy for getting at least half the herd to Elko ahead of schedule. Nash proved himself not only capable, but also respectful of Nora's knowledge of the ranch and her cattle. On the fourth day, as they were separating the strongest cattle for the drive, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Xavier Reynolds rode up with 4 of his men, surveying the activity with obvious displeasure. "Miss Dawson," he called, dismounting, "I see you've hired help." "Rather insufficient for what you're attempting, isn't it?" Nora straightened, pushing back her hat. "My business is my own, Mr. Reynolds. Was there something you needed?" Xavier's gaze shifted to Nash, who had moved to stand beside Nora. "And who might this be?" "Nash Rayburn," Nash answered for himself, not offering his hand. "A hired gun?" Xavier asked with a smirk. "A ranch hand," Nash corrected. "Though I'm handy with a gun when necessary." Xavier's eyes narrowed slightly before he turned his attention back to Nora. "I've come to improve my offer. $1,000 for the ranch, a final gesture of goodwill before the bank takes action." "Still a fraction of its worth," Nora replied, "and my answer remains no." Xavier's pleasant facade slipped, revealing the coldness beneath. "You're being foolish, Nora. A woman has no place running a ranch. As my wife, you'd want for nothing." "Except freedom, dignity, and self-respect," Nora countered. "I believe I've made my position clear, Mr. Reynolds. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." Xavier stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You belong with me, Nora. This stubborn resistance only delays the inevitable." Nash moved forward, his posture deceptively casual but his eyes hard. "Miss Dawson doesn't belong to you or anyone else, Reynolds. She belongs to herself." Xavier's head snapped toward Nash, his face flushing with anger. "This is none of your concern, hired hand. Mind your place." "My place is where I'm paid to be," Nash replied evenly. "Right now, that's helping Miss Dawson run her ranch. You're interfering with our work." For a tense moment, Xavier seemed ready to escalate the confrontation, his hand hovering near his holstered pistol. Then, with visible effort, he regained his composure. "Consider my improved offer, Nora. It expires in 3 days." He mounted his horse, looking down at them with cold determination. "I always get what I want one way or another. Remember that." As they rode away, Nora released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you for standing with me. Xavier Reynolds is not accustomed to being refused." Nash's expression remained grim as he watched the riders disappear. Men like that understand only one thing: power. And right now, he believes he holds all of it. He turned to her, his face softening. "But he's wrong about you. I've known plenty of women who can run ranches as well as any man, better in some cases." "My father believed that too," Nora said, touched by his support. "He taught me everything he knew, said there was no reason I couldn't manage on my own someday. I don't think he expected someday to come so soon, though." Nash nodded toward the cattle they'd been sorting. "Well, let's prove them both right. If we finish selecting the herd today, we can start the drive tomorrow at first light." They worked through the day and into the evening, selecting 150 of the strongest cattle for the drive, packing supplies, and making final preparations. As they sat by the fire that night, exhausted but satisfied with their progress, Nora found herself studying Nash's profile in the firelight, wondering about the path that had brought him to her door at precisely the moment she needed help. "Why did you offer to help me?" she asked suddenly. "The pay is poor, the work is hard, and success is far from guaranteed." Nash poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing into the night sky before answering. "I've spent most of my life drifting from one job to another, never staying long enough to put down roots. when I heard about your situation. I don't know. Something told me to stay to help if I could. Well, I'm grateful you listened to that something, Nora said softly. Nash looked up, meeting her eyes across the fire. So am I. The cattle drive began at dawn the next morning, Nora and Nash working in perfect tandem, despite the enormous challenge before them. With only 2 riders, they could manage the herd only by driving them slowly and carefully, making half the normal daily progress. Nash took the lead position while Nora rode drag, keeping the stragglers moving. By nightfall, they had covered only 5 miles instead of the usual 12 or 15 with a full crew. We'll need to adjust our expectations, Nash admitted as they made camp that first night, the cattle settling nearby. At this rate, it'll take us 8 days to reach Elko. That still gives us time to sell the cattle and return with the money before the bank's deadline, Nora pointed out. As long as nothing delays us. Something did delay them the very next day. A sudden thunderstorm spooked the cattle, causing a small stampede that took hours to control. By the time they had regrouped, they'd lost nearly half a day and a dozen head that had run off in various directions. We can't afford to lose more, Nora said, wiping rain from her face as they surveyed the remaining herd. Maybe this was too ambitious with just the 2 of us. We'll manage, Nash assured her, though his own exhaustion was evident. We just need to be smarter about it. The cattle need to rest at night anyway. If we push a bit harder during daylight, we can still make it. They adjusted their strategy, rising earlier and stopping later, pushing themselves and their horses to the limits of endurance. By the 5th day, they had settled into a rhythm, the cattle more cooperative as they grew accustomed to the routine. On the morning of the 6th day, as they were breaking camp, Nash suddenly went still, listening. Riders coming, several of them. Nora's hand moved instinctively to the rifle in her saddle scabbard. Reynolds, possibly, get ready to move the herd. But it wasn't Reynolds who appeared over the ridge. 5 riders approached, led by a grizzled older man with a silver beard and weathered face. Looks like you folks could use a hand, the man called as they rode up. Nash moved protectively closer to Nora, his hand near his holster. And you are, Daniel Blackburn. This here's my son Caleb and some hands from our place east of here. We were tracking some strays when we spotted your herd. The old man's eyes crinkled with good humor. Don't often see a 2-person cattle drive. That's either mighty brave or mighty foolish. A bit of both, I suspect, Nora admitted, relaxing slightly at the man's friendly demeanor. I'm Nora Dawson. This is Nash Rayburn. Dawson, Daniel repeated. Any relation to Thomas Dawson from McGill, my father, Nora confirmed. He passed recently. Daniel removed his hat respectfully. Sorry to hear that. Thomas and I drove cattle together years back before either of us had ranches of our own. Good man. The coincidence seemed too fortuitous to believe, but the genuine sadness in Daniel's eyes convinced Nora he was telling the truth. Nash, however, remained wary. What brings you to this particular stretch of trail? He asked. Like I said, tracking strays. Spring roundup didn't go as planned. Daniel gestured to the cattle. Where you folks headed with this herd? Nora explained their situation, including the bank loan and Reynolds' pressure tactics. As she spoke, Daniel's expression grew increasingly troubled. Richard Reynolds has been trying to squeeze out smaller ranchers for years, he said when she finished. Bought out 3 of my neighbors already, usually after some unfortunate incident made staying impossible. What sort of incidents? Nash asked sharply. Cattle mysteriously dying. Water sources suddenly drying up, buildings catching fire. Daniel shrugged. Nothing that could be proven, but too many coincidences for comfort. Nora and Nash exchanged concerned glances. We haven't experienced anything like that, Nora said. At least not yet. You wouldn't, Daniel replied. Not with Thomas only recently passed. Reynolds likes to appear respectable. He'll try the legitimate route, first buying you out, pressuring the bank. It's only when that fails that accidents start happening. Well, we're determined not to let him succeed, Nora stated firmly. We need to get these cattle to Elko within the next 2 days to have any chance. Daniel looked at his men, then back at Nora. My son and I were heading to Elko anyway to purchase some new breeding stock. We'd be happy to help you drive these cattle the rest of the way. Nash's expression remained skeptical. That's a generous offer from strangers. Daniel's weathered face cracked into a smile. Not strangers, friends of Thomas Dawson and enemies of Richard Reynolds. That makes us allies in my book. With Daniel, Caleb, and their 3 hands joining the drive, progress accelerated dramatically. What would have taken Nora and Nash another 3 or 4 days was accomplished in just under 2. By mid-afternoon of the 8th day since leaving the ranch, they drove the herd into Elko, where cattle buyers for the railroad were waiting. The price was better than Nora had dared hope, nearly $18 a head, bringing their total to just over $2,600 after the cattle buyer's fee. It was enough to pay off the bank loan with a small cushion remaining for supplies and wages. I can't thank you enough, Nora told Daniel and his men as they prepared to part ways in Elko. Without your help, we'd still be days away. Happy to help Thomas Dawson's daughter, Daniel replied warmly. You remind me of him, same determination in your eyes. As Daniel and his men rode toward the livestock auction, Nora turned to Nash, her face glowing with triumph. We did it. We actually did it. Nash's smile matched hers, relief evident in his posture. We did. Now we just need to get back to McGill and pay that bank note before Reynolds realizes what we've done. They spent the night in Elko, taking separate rooms at a modest hotel, their first real beds in over a week. After hot baths and a proper meal, they met in the hotel dining room to plan their return journey. We should leave at first light, Nash suggested. If we ride hard, we can make it back to McGill in 2 days. Nora nodded, then hesitated. What happens after that? Nash looked up from his coffee, a question in his eyes. After what? After we pay the bank. Will you stay on at the ranch or continue your wandering? It was a question Nash had been asking himself with increasing frequency over the past 2 weeks. Something about Nora Dawson and her determination had gotten under his skin in a way no person or place had before. I hadn't thought that far ahead, he said carefully. Would you want me to stay? Nora met his gaze steadily. Yes. The ranch needs good hands, and you've more than proven your worth. Nash heard what she said and what she didn't say. Is it just the ranch that needs me? A flush crept up Nora's cheeks, but she didn't look away. No, not just the ranch. Nash reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Then I'll stay, for as long as you want me to. The moment hung between them, full of unspoken possibilities, until a waiter's approach broke the spell. They finished their meal with lighter hearts, making plans for improvements to the ranch once the bank loan was settled. They left Elko the next morning as planned, the money secured in Nash's saddlebags with a small portion in Nora's for safety. The journey back was physically demanding, but emotionally lighter, both of them buoyed by their success and the tentative understanding that had formed between them. They camped one night on the trail, and as they sat by the fire, Nash shared more of his past, the loss of his parents to fever when he was just 8, the uncle who raised him with gruff affection but little tenderness, the years of drifting after his uncle's death. I never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, he admitted. Always thought I was looking for something, but I couldn't have told you what. And now, Nora asked softly, Nash looked at her across the flames, his expression more open than she'd seen before. "Now I'm thinking maybe I wasn't looking for a what, but a who." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Nora felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through her chest. Before she could respond, however, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Nash was on his feet instantly, gun drawn, positioning himself between Nora and the darkness beyond their camp. "Get behind the horses," he ordered quietly. Nora grabbed her rifle instead, moving to stand beside him. "If it's trouble, we face it together." 4 riders emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by bandanas pulled up over their noses. The lead rider kept his horse just outside the circle of firelight. "That's far enough," Nash called, his voice steady. "State your business." "Heard you folks might be carrying a substantial sum," the leader replied, his voice muffled by the bandana. "We'd like to relieve you of that burden." Nora's grip tightened on her rifle. "You heard wrong. We're just ranch hands heading home." A second rider laughed. "That's not what they're saying in Elko. Word is Thomas Dawson's daughter just sold a herd for a handsome price." Nash's jaw tightened imperceptibly. These weren't random bandits they'd been sent, and there was only one person who would benefit from Nora failing to make it back with the money. "You're working for Reynolds," he stated flatly. The leader didn't deny it. "Doesn't matter who we're working for. Hand over the money and you can be on your way. Nobody needs to get hurt." "And if we refuse," Nora challenged. "Then somebody definitely gets hurt," the man replied coldly. "Starting with your hired gun here." Nash assessed their situation with lightning speed. 4 against 2, with the bandits already having the advantage of surprise and position. Fighting would likely end badly. "The money's in my saddlebags," he said, lowering his gun slightly. "Let me get it for you." "Nash," Nora hissed, disbelieving. He gave her a look that silently urged her to trust him. "It's not worth dying over, Nora." Moving slowly, Nash walked to his horse, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. As he reached for the saddlebag, he whispered to the horse, a command barely audible. Then, in one fluid motion, he slapped the horse's flank hard while simultaneously dropping to one knee and firing at the nearest bandit. The horse reared and bolted directly toward the riders, causing confusion as Nash's bullet found its mark, unseating one of the men. Nora reacted instantly, firing her rifle and forcing the others to scatter. "Run!" Nash shouted, laying down cover fire as Nora sprinted for her horse. In the chaos, they managed to mount and gallop away, bullets whizzing past them in the darkness. They rode hard for nearly an hour, taking a different route than their original trail, before finally slowing to rest the exhausted horses. "Are you hurt?" Nash asked, scanning Nora for injuries in the moonlight. "No," she panted, her heart still racing. "You grazed my arm, but it's nothing." He dismounted, checking their surroundings. "We should be safe for now, but we need to keep moving. They'll be looking for us come daylight." Nora slid from her saddle, legs trembling with the aftermath of fear and exertion. "The money is safe," Nash finished, patting his jacket. "I only keep traveling money in my saddlebags. The banknotes are sewn into the lining of my coat." Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by admiration. "You anticipated trouble." "After what Daniel Blackburn told us about Reynolds, I wasn't taking chances." Nash's expression darkened. "Those men knew exactly when we'd be returning and how much money we'd have. Someone in Elko is on Reynolds' payroll." They continued through the night, taking a longer but less traveled route back toward McGill. By dawn, they were exhausted but had put significant distance between themselves and their pursuers. "We need to rest the horses," Nora finally conceded as the sun rose. "And ourselves." They found a small grove of cottonwoods beside a stream, offering both water and concealment. After tending to the horses, they settled against a fallen log, sharing the last of their jerky and coffee. "We should reach McGill by nightfall if we push hard," Nash calculated. "The bank will be closed, but first thing tomorrow morning, we can pay that note." Nora nodded, then turned to examine the graze on his arm that he'd been downplaying. "This needs cleaning," she insisted, tearing a strip from her petticoat to use as a bandage. As she worked, Nash watched her face, so intent on her task. "You know," he said quietly, "most women would be falling apart after what we've just been through. You haven't even complained." "Complaining doesn't solve problems," Nora replied matter-of-factly, though his words warmed her. "My father always said you can cry about your troubles or you can fix them, but you can't do both at the same time." "Wise man," Nash murmured, wincing slightly as she tied off the bandage. "About what I said last night before we were interrupted." Nora's hand stilled, her eyes lifting to meet his. "About finding a who instead of a what," Nash nodded, suddenly unsure of himself in a way that had nothing to do with bandits or bullets. "I meant it. These past 2 weeks, working alongside you, seeing your courage and determination. I've never met anyone like you, Nora Dawson." "I've never met anyone like you either," she admitted softly. "Most men would have run from the challenge or tried to take over completely. You've been a true partner." "Is that what you want, a partner?" His hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her face, lingering against her cheek. Nora leaned into his touch, her heart racing for entirely different reasons than it had earlier. "Yes, in all things." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, a question being asked and answered, before deepening into something more urgent. Nora's arms wound around Nash's neck, pulling him closer as years of loneliness and weeks of uncertainty melted away in the warmth of his embrace. When they finally broke apart, Nash rested his forehead against hers, his breath coming quick and uneven. "We should probably get moving if we want to reach McGill by nightfall." Nora laughed softly, reluctantly pulling away. "Always practical, Mr. Rayburn." "Only about some things," he replied with a grin that made her blush. "For others, I find I'm becoming remarkably impractical." They reached McGill as dusk was falling, slipping into town quietly to avoid drawing attention. Rather than returning to the ranch, where Reynolds' men might be watching, they took rooms at the small hotel, planning to visit the bank first thing in the morning. However, their plans changed when Sheriff Miller knocked on Nash's door shortly after their arrival. "Thought you ought to know," the sheriff said after Nash invited him in. "There was trouble out at the Dawson ranch yesterday. Barn caught fire. Luckily, one of Daniel Blackburn's men was passing by and helped put it out before it spread to the house." Nora, who had joined them from her adjacent room, gasped. "Was anyone hurt?" "No, madam, but it's mighty suspicious timing. Reynolds' men have been asking around town about when you might be returning." The sheriff looked between them knowingly. "Word is you've been to Elko selling cattle." "News travels fast," Nash observed grimly. "Small town," Miller replied with a shrug. "Also heard there was an attempt to rob you on the trail back." Nora's eyes widened. "How could you know that?" "Because one of the would-be robbers rode in this afternoon with a bullet in his shoulder, claiming he was ambushed by road agents." Miller's mustache twitched with what might have been amusement. "Interesting coincidence." Nash exchanged a look with Nora before addressing the sheriff. "We need to pay off Nora's bank loan tomorrow morning, but Reynolds seems determined to prevent that." Miller nodded thoughtfully. "I can escort you to the bank myself. As for tonight, I suggest you both stay put. I'll have a deputy watch the hotel." After the sheriff left, Nora paced the small room anxiously. What if they try to burn the house next? Everything my father built. We'll head out there first thing after the bank, Nash assured her. Reynolds won't win, Nora, I promise you that. She stopped pacing, turning to face him with determination replacing her worry. No, he won't, because unlike him, we have something worth fighting for. Nash pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if to physically shield her from all threats. Yes, we do. The next morning, true to his word, Sheriff Miller escorted them to the bank as soon as it opened. Mr. Holloway seemed surprised and perhaps a bit disappointed to see them arrive with the full amount of the loan. I must say, Miss Dawson, this is unexpected, the banker commented as he counted the money. Mr. Reynolds assured me you wouldn't be able to meet the obligation. I'm sure he did, Nora replied coolly. I trust you'll provide written confirmation that the loan is paid in full, and all claims against the Dawson Ranch are satisfied. Holloway hesitated just long enough to confirm Nash's suspicion that the banker had been in Reynolds' pocket all along. Of course. I'll prepare the documents immediately. As they waited, the bank's door opened, and Xavier Reynolds strode in, stopping short at the sight of Nora and Nash with Sheriff Miller. What a pleasant surprise, Xavier said, recovering quickly though his eyes blazed with anger. I wasn't aware you had returned to McGill, Miss Dawson. Evidently not, Nora replied, or your welcome would have been even more dramatic than a barn fire. Xavier's face remained impassive. I heard about that unfortunate incident. Barn fires are all too common, I'm afraid. Spontaneous combustion in hay is a serious danger, especially when helped along by coal oil and a match, Nash commented dryly. Xavier's gaze shifted to Nash, hatred clear in his eyes despite his pleasant tone. You seem to have developed quite an attachment to Miss Dawson's property, Mr. Rayburn. One might question your motives. My motives are transparent, unlike yours, Nash replied evenly. I'm helping a lady protect what's rightfully hers from a man who believes he can take whatever he wants. Xavier stepped closer, lowering his voice. This isn't over. That land will be mine eventually, one way or another. And when it is, you still won't have me, Nora interrupted, taking Nash's hand firmly in hers. Because unlike the land, I've already given my heart freely to someone who respects me as a person, not a possession. The shock on Xavier's face was quickly masked by cold fury. We'll see about that. Your father might want to reconsider his tactics, Sheriff Miller interjected, stepping forward. Attempted robbery, arson. These are serious crimes, Mr. Reynolds. The sort that could lead to uncomfortable investigations. Xavier's jaw worked as he visibly restrained his temper. You have no proof of anything, Sheriff. Not yet, Miller agreed. But if anything else happens to Miss Dawson or her property, I'll find it. Count on that. Mr. Holloway chose that moment to return with the loan documents, handing them to Nora with forced politeness. Everything is in order, Miss Dawson. The loan is paid in full. Nora took the papers, checking them carefully before nodding her satisfaction. Thank you, Mr. Holloway. Good day, gentlemen. As they left the bank, Nash kept a protective arm around Nora's shoulders, both of them aware of Xavier's burning gaze following them out. He won't give up easily, Nash warned as they mounted their horses for the ride back to the ranch. Men like Reynolds don't handle defeat well. Then he'd better get used to disappointment, Nora replied with determination, because I'm not going anywhere. They found the ranch much as the sheriff had described, the barn damaged but still standing, the house untouched. Over the next few days, they worked to repair the barn and assess what other work needed to be done before winter. True to Nash's prediction, Reynolds didn't give up easily. Over the following weeks, they faced a series of accidents and setbacks. Fences mysteriously cut, a small section of their herd driven off, threats made to potential ranch hands Nash tried to hire in town. Through it all, Nash remained steadfast at Nora's side, his commitment to her and the ranch never wavering. Their partnership deepened, both professionally and personally, as they fought together against Reynolds' increasingly desperate attempts to force them out. The turning point came in late summer, when Richard Reynolds himself finally entered the conflict directly. He arrived at the Dawson ranch unannounced one afternoon, accompanied by Xavier and two other men. Nora and Nash were mending the corral when the riders approached. Nash straightened, hammer still in hand, as the elder Reynolds dismounted with the stiff movements of a man unaccustomed to horseback riding in his later years. "Miss Dawson," Richard Reynolds called, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "I believe it's time we spoke directly, without intermediaries or misunderstandings." Nora set down her tools, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached the fence. Nash moved to stand beside her, his posture relaxed but alert. "Mr. Reynolds," Nora acknowledged coolly. "What brings you to my property?" "A business proposition," Reynolds replied, his sharp eyes taking in the repaired barn and well-maintained buildings with poorly concealed surprise. "One that I believe will benefit us both." "I'm listening," Nora said, though her tone suggested little interest. Reynolds gestured expansively. "You've done remarkably well maintaining this place, I'll grant you that. But winter is coming and you're understaffed. Xavier tells me you've had difficulty hiring hands. Difficulty created by your threats to anyone who considers working for me," Nora countered. Reynolds waved this away as if it were a trivial detail. "Business tactics, nothing personal, but I'm prepared to end all that today." He reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing an envelope. "My final offer, $5,000 for the ranch. A fair price, more than fair given the circumstances." Nash couldn't help but whistle softly at the amount over twice what the property might typically fetch. Nora, however, didn't flinch. "And if I refuse?" "Then I fear the accidents my son mentioned might continue," Reynolds replied smoothly, "perhaps becoming more severe." Winter is a dangerous time on an isolated ranch. Nash stepped forward, his patience evaporating. "That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Reynolds." "Merely an observation of reality," Reynolds replied, his cold gaze shifting to Nash. "And you are Nash Rayburn, Miss Dawson's partner." "Partner," Reynolds repeated, his eyebrows rising as he looked between them. "I see. Well, Mr. Rayburn, perhaps you can persuade Miss Dawson to be reasonable. $5,000 would allow you both to start fresh elsewhere without the complications you've been experiencing here." "The only complication we're experiencing is you," Nora stated firmly, "and your son's inability to accept rejection." Xavier flushed angrily but remained silent at his father's warning glance. "Consider carefully, Miss Dawson," Reynolds said, his voice hardening. "This offer expires today. After that, I wash my hands of the entire matter. Whatever happens next will be unfortunate but not my concern." Nash had heard enough. "Mr. Reynolds, let me be clear. Your threats don't frighten us. If anything happens to Nora or this ranch, you'll answer for it to the law and to me personally." "Is that a threat, Mr. Rayburn?" Reynolds asked, his voice dangerously soft. "No, sir, it's a promise," Nash replied evenly. "Now, unless you have legitimate business to discuss, I suggest you leave before this conversation becomes even less pleasant." Richard Reynolds studied Nash for a long moment, reassessing the situation. Whatever he saw must have given him pause, for he tucked the envelope back into his pocket with deliberate care. "You're making a mistake," he said finally, addressing Nora. "One you'll both regret." "The only mistake would be selling to a man who uses intimidation and threats to get what he wants," Nora replied. "Good day, Mr. Reynolds." As the Reynolds party rode away, Nash turned to Nora with concern. "That won't be the end of it." "No," she agreed. "But it might be the beginning of the end. Did you see his face when he realized we weren't intimidated? He's not used to that." Nash smiled despite his worry. "You really are something, Nora Dawson. Most people would have taken that money and run." "Most people haven't found something worth standing their ground for," she replied, her eyes holding his. "I have." Their prediction proved accurate. Richard Reynolds didn't give up, but his tactics changed. Instead of direct threats and sabotage, he attempted to isolate them economically, pressuring merchants in McGill to refuse their business and buyers to reject their cattle. What Reynolds hadn't counted on, however, was the network of support that had quietly formed around Nora and Nash. Daniel Blackburn spread word among other independent ranchers about Reynolds' tactics, creating an informal alliance of smaller operations. Sheriff Miller made it known around town that he was watching the situation closely. Even Mr. Holloway, perhaps sensing which way the wind was blowing, began to distance himself from Reynolds' schemes. By late fall, the tide had turned. Reynolds' influence in the territory was waning as others grew tired of his heavy-handed methods. When the bank in Elko offered Nora a line of credit for ranch improvements based on Daniel Blackburn's recommendation, it signaled a definitive shift in the balance of power. The first snow of winter fell on a crisp November day, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Nora stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching as Nash led the last of the cattle into the sheltered pasture they'd prepared. 9 months had passed since her father's death, months filled with more challenges and changes than she could have imagined. The ranch was secure now, the loan paid, the threat from Reynolds diminished if not entirely gone. They had 3 reliable hands working for them, hired with Daniel's help, and plans for expanding the herd in the spring. Nash joined her on the porch, stomping snow from his boots before pulling her into his arms. "Everything's buttoned up for the storm. We're ready." "Yes," Nora agreed, leaning into his warmth. "We are." Nash kissed her forehead, then her lips, lingering there as snowflakes melted on their skin. When he finally pulled back, his expression was serious. "I've been thinking," he began, suddenly nervous in a way that made Nora's heart flutter, "about the future, our future." "Have you now?" she teased gently, though her own pulse quickened. "I have." Nash reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "I've never had a home, Nora, never had a place or a person that made me want to stay put. Until you." He unwrapped the handkerchief, revealing a simple gold band. "I'm not a wealthy man, and I can't offer you anything you don't already have. But I can offer you this: my heart, my hands, and my promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, for all the days we have." Tears welled in Nora's eyes as Nash dropped to one knee in the snow, holding the ring up to her. "Nora Dawson, will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Nash Rayburn, I will marry you." Nash slipped the ring onto her finger, then swept her into his arms, kissing her with all the passion and promise of their future together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Nash rested his forehead against hers. "Your father would be proud of you," he said softly. "Of how you fought for what's yours." "What's ours now," Nora corrected, her heart full to bursting. "And yes, I think he would be." They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch, with Sheriff Miller officiating, Daniel Blackburn standing as Nash's best man, and the handful of friends they'd made through their struggles gathering to celebrate. The winter snow fell softly outside as they exchanged vows before the hearth in the home Nora's father had built, now the foundation for a new family. Spring brought new beginnings in more ways than one. The cattle delivered a healthy crop of calves. The ranch flourished under their joint management. And by early summer, Nora was carrying their first child. Word reached them in July that Richard Reynolds had suffered a stroke, leaving Xavier in charge of the family's holdings. Contrary to their fears, Xavier seemed to have lost interest in pursuing his father's vendetta, perhaps humbled by his new responsibilities, or simply recognizing a lost cause when he saw one. The years that followed brought their share of hardships: droughts, harsh winters, fluctuating cattle prices, but also immeasurable joys. Their son, Thomas, named for Nora's father, was born healthy and strong in the winter of 1879. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and another son, James, 3 years after that. The Rayburn Ranch, as it came to be known throughout the territory, grew in reputation and prosperity. Nash's innovative breeding practices and Nora's shrewd business sense created one of the most successful operations in Nevada. They built a larger house as their family expanded, though they kept the original cabin standing as a reminder of where they'd started. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Nash surprised Nora with a special gift: the deed to the water rights for the entirety of Cottonwood Creek, which he'd quietly purchased from neighboring properties over the years. "Now no one can ever threaten our water again," he told her as they stood by the creek that had been at the heart of Reynolds' desire for their land. "This belongs to our children and their children after them." Nora, her hand resting on the slight swell of their fourth child growing beneath her dress, looked out over the land they had fought for and won together. "Remember what you said to Xavier Reynolds that first day, that I didn't belong to anyone but myself?" Nash nodded, smiling at the memory. "I remember. You were right," she said, turning to face him. "I belong to myself, but I also belong with you, Nash Rayburn, by choice, every single day." "And I with you," Nash replied, gathering her close, "the best choice I ever made." As the sun set over the Nevada mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Nora and Nash stood together on the land that had tested them, challenged them, and ultimately rewarded their perseverance. From the tragedy of loss had blossomed a love story that would be told in the territory for generations: how a determined woman and the cowboy who stood by her side had fought for the right to determine their own destiny, and won. The Rayburn Ranch would stand as testament to their courage for over a century to come, a legacy built on the simple truth that had brought them together. That true belonging comes not from possession, but from partnership, respect, and love freely given.